2 minutes to go, but we can begin. Hello, everybody watching at home. Good morning to everybody watching in this side of the world. Good afternoon to anybody watching in Japan or that side of the world. We are live. Welcome to this artist talk in relation to the ongoing exhibition at Nitya Center for Contemporary Art in Lillestrøm. The exhibition is Ingen død, bare respawn. Never death, only respawn, an exhibition exploring the blurred lines between video games and art, and artists exhibiting works that have been influenced by video games. So today we are very lucky to have with us Petra Szemán, from who's streaming live from Tokyo. Hello, Petra.
Hello.
To have you here.
Thank you for having me on the little side series and also the exhibition. It's really fun.
Yeah. It's been fantastic so far. We've already been having a wonderful conversation before we started live streaming. I will just give you guys watching at home a little introduction to Petra. So Petra is a moving image artist working with animation and in her own words, game-like landscapes, or their own words. Their practice focuses on the murky borderlands along the arbitrary line separating real and fictional. This is an ongoing theme within their work. They explore the kinds of lives and experience that are possible within these separations between the real and fictional. Using a virtual version of themselves as a protagonist journeying through animatic realms, they explore liminal spaces and threshold situations, looking to dissect the ways our memories and selves are constructed within a landscape oversaturated with fiction, both on and off the screen. That is taken directly from Petra's website, which is their own words. So let's get straight into it. Petra, your artwork has this real depth to it, and you chose to use the medium of moving image, utilizing digital tools to create layered fictional worlds with video game elements, anime elements, as well as real world settings. Could you explain, like, how do you choose your mediums? Where did this this love for animation come from, and why did you choose it as your main medium?
Well, I think it's been basically something that I've been really into since I was a child, but it was also sort of accidental. So I don't really have like an artist background. My family is not like a family of artists or like art adjacent people. But like since I was a kid, I was really into animation, and particularly anime, which at the time I did not know was like Japanese animation. It was just on television, and then I was watching it and it was really fun. And then I had this like personal interest, but I never made the connection between this and like an art practice. And then I didn't really have like an art education or like an art A-level equivalent. So like when I went to uni to do art, I was going to do painting because I thought that's what you did when you were into the arts. And then I went to uni, I really hated it. And then I was having a crisis. And then randomly we had to sign up for a workshop in second year. And then there was one that sounded cool about After Effects. And then I just signed up. And then it basically has been like snowballing from there, of like a love at first sight sort of sort of relationship with how like video compositing works in After Effects, and then it's just been escalating since then.
For those who don't know, Adobe After Effects is a tool to manipulate video and animation. It's used by a lot of people to change the way videos interact and how we look at video. And it's a fantastic tool for bringing in outside sources into a video film world. So you mentioned your studies there. You studied in the UK, and that's really where you trained as an artist. With this crisis you were talking about of mediums, you say you took this course to do After Effects. Why did you begin to choose the actual subject matters that you were addressing, the aesthetics of the work?
I cannot fully, actually I can show you something that I was introduced to, which maybe I can find easily. But basically I was just shown a bunch of videos, and then there was an artist, I think it was by Michael Bell Smith, called like Up and Away, and it's just this landscape that just is like an endless scroll, but all the bits of the landscape are extracted from video games. I actually had the link saved somewhere, so it would be very nice if I could locate it extremely fast, but that may not be a possibility.
We could
basically
post it in the comment section of the YouTube video afterwards.
Yeah, the title was definitely Up and Away, and artist maybe Michael Bell Smith. Sorry for spelling mistakes, but yeah, so basically I saw this like extreme collage video, and I think the teacher, like the professor, like chose to show these to us to like illustrate how, because the After Effects can combine so many layers into one cohesive like moving image piece, which was basically the base of the software. And I was really into this idea of taking elements of the different landscapes and then combining them together. And then I had to make something in the workshop, so I just thought, oh, what's stuff that I'm into at the moment? So I just used pictures that I took on holiday recently when I went back to Hungary, which is where I grew up. And then I also used pictures from anime that I was getting back into, because I was sort of getting reacquainted with being a weeb at the time. And it just kind of developed naturally. And because a lot of the stuff I was using was like cartoonish or gamey, I kind of made the whole video that I made along like a game-like structure, having like a little protagonist who was jumping between different bits of landscapes that kept shifting as the video was progressing. It sounds cool when I describe it, but this was in like second year of university, so it was not that well executed, but it was a really fun starting point. And I think the stuff that I'm doing now is basically the same thing, but like just on different levels and slightly different approaches.
When you chose that medium in university, well, I mean, you studied in the mid to it was the early 2000s?
Not that early. It was between 2013 and 2017. It was like a 4-year course.
So that's still almost 10 years ago. So the acknowledgement of these digital mediums as an artistic medium has become more mainstream within contemporary art. How was your choice of medium received by your lecturers at that point?
I think as a choice of medium, as in like moving image or animation, that was vaguely fine. Though I think at the time I have heard discourse that there was like a bias against moving image generally in like art school courses, like kind of like a too much of a fine line between like what's a film and what's an artist moving image. Not that that was the category that I fell into personally, but that was definitely a thing. But I think what was the main issue was that I was taking too much of a nerdy approach. Like it was like elements of what I was using were just a bit too embarrassing, or like not arty enough, or like I wasn't interacting with the theory in the way that it was supposedly the good way to look at the theory. And then as a result of that, I have had some, which I call fights, but they were just like intense conversations with tutors, as you do. But then these worked really well with like solidifying in me why I thought that what I was doing had like something valuable to be pursued.
Mm-hmm. Their banal advice helped you to focus your or enhance your practice, definitely.
There was also really good people there who like took it in, even though it was something that they were really not familiar with or like very far away from their own practices and research interests. And so it was like a mixture of like really good constructive advice, but also like a sense of like, I have to fight for this medium to be like taken seriously as an art practice, not even medium, but like the medium itself, and also how I happened to approach it.
But let's go back a little bit and talk about influences on your practice. What do you feel truly inspires your practice, and is there any influences that you could discuss that have helped to shape your aesthetic and your practice?
I think the first and maybe most important artistic influence that I received was that when I was getting into video, one of my tutors recommended me to look at the work of David Blandy, and whose work I just wasn't familiar with at all at the time. And then I basically fell in love at first sight. And then at the time, the videos he was making kind of often used like a 2D animated character overlaid with like real imagery or like edited bits from animations. Or there was this video that I particularly liked from him called Backgrounds, where he made little like fighting game sprites for himself and his dad, and they kind of walked through these like fighting game landscapes and then had a conversation about their own art practices and their relationship. And then so basically I saw that it was really good. And then I thought, this person has a cool cartoon alter ego. I could have a cool cartoon alter ego. So it kind of started from there. And I still like David's work a lot to this day. And well, he's become a great friend now, which is outstanding.
Oh, wow. I mean, that's a huge element, a major part of your practice is the protagonist that you have developed by the name of yourself, who seems to be almost a mirror image of you. And could you sort of elaborate on who yourself is and why you chose to have a protagonist which is so a copy of your own image, but also let's go from there.
Well, the starting point for yourself is really banal and quite disappointing, I think, but it's also fitting for the narrative construction, is that so I had to make video stuff, and I was looking for a character because that kind of drives the story forward in like a certain narrative way. And at the same time, I was also having a massive identity crisis and like thinking whether I should quit university and then not understanding anything. And then to kind of try to lift myself out of this crisis, I drew a comic in which my current pathetic self, that I refer to as yourself, was in conversation with my cool future self called Yourself, but cooler. And then kind of I had these things going on at the same time, and then it just seemed very obvious to use this character who was sort of me. Well, at the time, Yourself was definitely just a copy of me. So it was like, oh, I am putting myself into the work. And also the other reason is that I'm not that good at imagining stuff if it doesn't have a particular reason. So it just made sense to use myself. I don't know. Like everyone likes to talk about themselves. So it's also part of that, I think.
So you mentioned that you tried to develop a version of yourself, but in the future, yourself, but cooler.
Yeah, sort of foregoing this like painful character development with like a fun party trick where I kind of skip time.
So this sort of cyborg element of you yourself going through time. Yourself has been a protagonist in many of your works, and has developed over time as your practice has developed, both in terms of the physicality, aesthetics, the tools that you use, you getting better comprehended with the actual tools that you work with. So the actual physical qualities of this character yourself that you have developed has become more real, or has become has more depth to it, both in a physical sense, but also in a philosophical sense. Throughout your films, this character yourself is on an existential journey that you have placed the character within. How much of this is an autobiographical journey? How much of it is placed onto the character to explore?
Well, it's kind of hard to say, but also that's kind of the point of how the videos are constructed. I would say that most of it is anecdotal, but it's kind of, so it all started out so that I was at university doing the animation stuff. I was using like clips from anime that I was into, and then there was a scholarship at the university where they give you money so that you can go on like a research trip, and then do some stuff that is relevant for your practice. And then I thought, oh, what if I went to the real life counterparts of the places that yourself, the character, has encountered in animated form within my videos that I have been collaging together. And I happened to get this scholarship actually twice, which is wild. And then I got to go to Japan, and I went on like a bunch of so-called anime pilgrimages, which is when you go to real life locations of places that appeared in animated material. And then I took I was really into this idea of like I have sort of been to these spaces because yourself, who is kind of me, visited those realms in like animated form. So it was like a really strange duality, but like duality is not the right word, but at the time that's how I thought of it, of like real place, copy of real place in animated form, and then like a self that is here, and then a self that is virtual, and then how all these places interact in like a strange X rectangle love triangle relationship where like we're all trying to engage with words that we cannot quite see or reach. And then so this is kind of how the yourself and me and the word that I move around in, and then the word that yourself moves around in relationship started. And the stuff that comes up in the videos about journeys to places, I would like to say that all of like I don't really make stuff up in a grand way in my work. So if I talk about a journey, it's likely a journey that I have taken myself to a specific place. But I cannot say that everything is anecdotal, because also I change details and then for like narrative effect, but then often that becomes part of the meta narrative.
I think what's really interesting there is when you go to these locations physically, you're taking photographs as well. Those can then be placed or layered within your works, and whatever happens within that, even if you're taking a photograph, that photograph is not the real place. It's a depiction of it, as much as anything else that you have created is a depiction of the same place. So the layering of you actually physically being there is incredibly interesting as well, because you, not the character yourself, but you have a physical interaction with this space before documenting it in a photograph. How much of that interaction do you try to bring into your work, and how does it feel to actually be in a physical version of a space that you had created in an animation form?
I think I feel like there's multiple aspects to the question. So first one, if it manifests in the work, which I think it definitely does. Like, I think it's present in all the layerings of like the different perspectives, and then trying to navigate like whose viewpoint am I speaking from? Is it from me? Is it from the disembodied narrator that tends to narrate my videos? Is it from the point, like, viewpoint of yourself? And like, do I present the places as if seen from yourself, as like they are traveling through these realms, or are they from the viewpoint of my camera that I am holding as like a strange intruder to these realms that I can't quite access with this physical body? And then part 2 of the question was about like the significance of these places and how it feels in real life. I think this is something that I kind of vaguely touched on, maybe a bit too vaguely, in the game that I made for the show at Nitya, which, by the way, is downloadable online for free for anyone to enjoy. But going to these places it's at the same time a really elevating and fun experience, because it's kind of like you get to prolong this supposedly self-contained world of like a material that is outside of your reality, and it kind of, you can feel it seeping into your reality at the same time. So it's like, you would assume that if you see a film that like the story ends, like begins and ends within the like the film material, but it kind of like, if you do these like sort of fan activities of trying to like chase after that feeling of being there, I think that's definitely present in like the anime pilgrimage. But also it's really disappointing at the same time, because the angles are never quite right, the weather conditions are never quite right. The like, my knee hurts, it's 40 degrees, my backpack is really heavy, there's way too much traffic, and it's just like this really intense sinking disappointment of being human, of like, you go to this realm that is sort of outside of your perceptual boundaries, even though it's technically a depiction of the world that you live in. But it's just, it's at the same time an exhilarating feeling of like nearly getting to the place that you're aiming for, and then at the same time feeling like you were punched in the stomach and just like, aha, so this is the pain of being human.
This I mean, this balance is something that comes across within your practice, exploring your protagonist, yourself's viewpoints. And it's something that you discussed within your films as well, is the constraints of the created character, yourself, the constraints that they have, but also the constraints that you yourself has as a physical, for want of better words, person within the real world. I think that's a fascinating nuage construction. And as your practice has grown, as your own human character has developed, how much of yourself, the character that you have created, has had an influence on you in the physical world? And do you feel that you have come to the point where you are actually the yourself but cooler version?
Well, the first question about yourself's influence on my real life person. Well, one very definite influence is that my hair color has been pink for the past like 7 years, which is approximately how long I have been working with yourself in my videos. That makes it sound like we are like a cool collaborator duo. But I mean, I like the pink hair, it's fun and it's really easy to maintain, which has become a major point in my life as I left my early 20s. But it's just, I just feel so out of character if I change it. And that's entirely because of this like strange person who is like both me and then a separate character that happens to look like me. And then it's a strange relationship of, and then like not wanting to exit that relationship. And then that's a very like basic influence. There was a really fun influence of when I made the first part of the Monomyth Gaiden series, which is like a 4-part video series I worked on over the course of 2 years when I lived in Japan last time, just before the pandemic. And in the first part, it starts with like a sort of character creation screen, and it features 3 different yourselves. There is the original yourself that I started using when I was, I don't know, third year of university. That's like level 1 yourself. There's yourself, but a bit cooler, which happens to become the protagonist of the whole video series. And then there was the as of yet unlocked yourself, but like really cool. And for that character, when I made the scenes, I drew them with a nose piercing, which I didn't have at the time. And I'm really scared of needles, especially when they like go through bits of your body. So I just found it really hard, but I thought it was so cool to have a nose ring. And then time kept passing and the video kept getting close to being finished. And then I had to choose between going back to re-edit those scenes and remove the nose piercing to match real life, or just sucking it up and going to get my nose pierced, which was a lot less painful than like having to go back and then change all the character sprites. So I do have a nose piercing now. So that was like a really strange experience. I also had weird experiences where like yourself is always like a bit lagging behind. It felt like a very monumental thing. Like if someone has seen the Monolith Guidance series, yourself has hair approximately up to here, which I had when I started the series. And then approximately 2 months after that, I cut my hair extremely short, like nearly shaved. But I felt like for the hair change, there has to be a narrative motive behind it for the hair to change for yourself in the videos. And I just couldn't pull that off within the Monolith Guidance series. So the hair stayed inaccurate for 2 years, which I was really personally annoyed by. And then it felt really monumental that in my most recent video, which is titled Openings, yourself now has short hair. So yeah, but that's really banal and like kind of boring details, but it's the kind of stuff that I get really stuck on. I'm also really anal about like only having yourself wear clothes that I own in real life, ideally stuff that I wore on a journey to places that show up in the video. But it's like that's the stuff that's not necessary but feels very important for a relationship to stay alive.
I mean, it's very hard to get hold of clothes that don't exist in a physical world. It's much easier to create something that already exists in the physical world.
It also leads to very stupid choices. Like in the second part of the Monolith series, I recently, like at the time, I just bought some new trousers that had like a checkered pattern on them. And then I just was so happy with them that I started making the video with yourself wearing checkered trousers. And I draw the animation frame by frame. And I would not like to think about how many times I had to draw the checkered pattern, but I really hated myself by like 10% in, but I was like, I cannot give up. It has to be true. I wore those when I went on the pilgrimage, but that felt like an unnecessary, stupid decision. But it also, I think it adds to the strange tension between yourself and me.
So as well as, because you're a moving image artist, as well as actually creating film work, video work, you created a number of video games. That interaction changes the dynamic from a film work. Could you sort of explain your thinking behind that, and how does it feel to hand over the control of your character, yourself, to somebody else, to an audience?
I think at first I want to talk a bit about how I feel about making games and why. Well, I feel like I have made a number of games in the past. Not all of them successful, actually most of them not successful. And what I mean by that is that I always felt the need, because I think when you do like digital art, it's really easy to make a game because like the technology is often freely available. You can make the stuff, but I just really wanted to make something where the game mechanic has a very specific reason or like really adds something to the work. Because sometimes I see with like artists' games that it's just like, it's more about like, oh, I can make a game, so I made one, and there's also some art in it. It's not like there's not really a conscious interaction that really harvests the potential of the game format. And so the games I have made in the past, I think were deeply unsuccessful in this regard. And the one that I made most recently, I am mostly happy with, and I think it achieved vaguely what I wanted. Well, obviously it's not like full satisfaction, but I had this really strong desire to want to make a game that made sense as a game, as opposed to just happen to be a game because I can make them. And then as I was going into the development of the game that I finished very recently, which is titled The Shape of Words to Come, which is vaguely a Battlestar Galactica reference. Anyway, so when I was going into that, I actually felt really uncomfortable writing the narrative, partially because I'm really attached to the video flow, even though my narratives tend to be quite like floaty and vague and a bit abstract. It just felt really strange to have to negotiate wanting to deliver a very precise experience. Not that I can control how the viewer experiences the work, but like I do have a sense of control in like how the narrative flows, and then having to add in like certain choice points where the character clicks on like chooses between different dialogue options or different thoughts that the player character is having, and then that changes where the narrative flows. And I found it really hard to deal with that kind of fluidity and like plasticity in the narrative. And also I felt really strange. I just, for a long time, I have so many notes that are like quite embarrassing, that are more like strangely emotional conversations between me and yourself as I'm writing the game, with the knowledge that I will have to like finish writing the code and export the game, and then yourself be out there talking to someone else. And that I cannot be there for that conversation. And well, I didn't really include these parts because I didn't feel that they were very necessary, and also they were a bit too cringy or embarrassing from my point of view. But it felt really strange, and I'm still not, I can't fully imagine how someone may see yourself when they are not me. But I think that may be just like my line of thinking. But yeah, I find it, and I've received feedback from people that they have found it very interesting to play the game because the relationship with yourself is so different. And it kind of pains me that that's something that I will never get to experience, because yourself is me and I am the one making the videos. But it's just, there is a difference, and I wonder what that is, but also that's not really for me to say.
This is almost a banal question now in this day and age, but who do you perceive the audience to be of your work, and how do you think about audience when you're creating your works?
I think when I make, I said this in a different artist talk once, is that the ideal audience for my work is me. Like I have a lot of excitement and like a really intense, I don't know, like obsessive tendencies. It's the autism is coming out. But then I think when I make the videos, I kind of envision like a small group of friends who I think can think in similar ways to me, and then wanting them to understand what I'm saying, and then also at the same time hoping that if fragments of what I make can resonate with anyone in any way, even if it's just like, hey, that looks neat, and then it's over. Like they don't have to watch the work. Like I feel like that's a successful relationship. But with the game, I found it really hard to envision the audience, because it's like such a private experience to play the game, and the flow of time is so different. And then I wasn't sure, but I think, I'm not sure if I think about the audience very objectively, very intensely, or very consciously. But it's definitely something that I address a lot when I think about like accessibility and whether my work is readable, and who am I really targeting, and who's gonna get this. But there are things that I know that no one will ever get, and I still put them in there because they satisfy me.
You've obviously been able to streamline your own workflow as you got better at using the tools that you work with. But a more simplistic question would be, how long does it take for you to create one of your film works with so many layers and so many ideas within them?
Yeah, that's a fun question. It's also like, well, a very central part of animation, that it takes so much time to make compared to the time in the final product. So for example, the Monomyth Guidance series, which was a 4-part series, I made over 2 years, where roughly that was my like full-time activity. I did some side things, but I was in Japan on like a 2-year scholarship, so I didn't really have to worry about income because the scholarship provided for that. So I think if you kind of count from that, it's like 6 months per video, and I think that's realistic for something the level of like the monomyth guidance series, which is, I think, quite decent. Recently, I made a new video that's titled Openings, and it uses a bit more elaborate animation than the monomyth guidance series. And I kind of worked on that for 1.5 years. Not full time, because obviously I couldn't do that, and funding is hard to get. That was kind of like just a thing that I really wanted to do, and then eventually partway through I got Arts Council funding that helped for me to live as I was making it, and also funded some other stuff, which was really cool. But
that's pretty much what I understood. I mean, I watched Openings again yesterday, and all these videos are available to watch on Petra's website. I think that's a brilliant aspect to it as well, is that your website is fantastic. It's incredibly interactive. You can play games on there that you've created. You can sort of semi-interact with the character yourself, but also the work that you show in exhibition is also available online. It doesn't have to necessarily be viewed within a white cube gallery space, although it often is. You were mentioned duality before. This duality between having your work in a physical location in an institution and having your work available online for somebody to find themselves without having to go to any art gallery. How does this interaction play out with the way you're creating your work? Do you think about this work's going to be shown in an institution, or do you think about this work is going to be shown online first?
I think with stuff like the monomyth guidance series, I think I only thought about online presentation because I didn't really have anything secured as I was developing it. It was more like it was a research project. So I was just making the videos, and then it was with the full knowledge that they may just go up online and then 20 people may watch them, if even, and then that will be a grand success. With the game I made recently, I thought about the limitations of like a gallery space and how that may be interacted within those constraints. It's kind of affected really like banal stuff. Like I had this idea that like, so in the game I made, there's 3 different endings. And I had this idea that there could be like a 4th ending that you can unlock if you play through all the routes in the game. But then that doesn't make sense in a gallery, because like someone can play through one and then someone else can come, and then it would like disrupt the flow and then the narrative system of the game itself. So that there was that. But I think for the video stuff, I think the ideal presentation in my head is always in like a really grand and elaborate video installation, which has not quite happened in my life yet, but I do have great visions where like the video would be displayed on like a really huge screen, and then there could be cool lights and then shards of other videos and then looping little fragments. I think that would be the ideal experience, but I always make them with the knowledge that it will have to be enough on someone's phone while sitting on a train home from work.
Trains is something we're going to get into
Yes.
very soon. I want to talk about layers. So your work and your personality is incredibly layered. We can talk about your background, being Hungarian, moving to the United Kingdom, eventually moving to Japan, having a base within the UK and in Japan. How much of these different cultures have shaped yourself and your practice, and how has moving to Japan changed your practice? Do you think Japanese culture, in seeing Japanese culture from a viewpoint where it's almost an alien thing, to actually being fully immersed within Japanese culture, has that changed how you work?
Well, so the first half, maybe it's best to approach from the second half. But I think, well, something that I'm quite conscious of in my identity is that I think this is something that I started to realize in recent years, especially in relation to fandom. And as I started consuming like anime and fandom related academic texts, which are very often written from like an American or if European at most like a UK perspective, is that someone who is like an English native has a very different experience with subculture from a place that is not in their language. Like, for example, I find it very formative that a lot of the anime that I watched in my early teens was, well, it was on YouTube because it was in the good old days when you could watch anime in 3 parts uploaded in YouTube with like burnt in English subtitles. But at that time, neither me nor my friends who were into this in like a really deep way spoke English nor Japanese. And yet we were like consuming these materials with like a really, yeah, like a great intensity. And then I think there is like a different sense of fandom that is born out of only being able to look at something that you cannot understand in the way of language. And yet you can still form a very close relationship with that material. And I think that's a specific difference that I feel between myself and someone who is like an English native. And then that's a perspective that I find is often missing from like fandom related academia, for example, that is very like US / at most UK focused, which is interesting in itself, but there's like, it tends to be a view that like those books speak about Western fandom, as in the West, as in like to the rest of Japan. But like there is major differences between like English speaking Western fandom and then non-English speaking Western fandom. And then the bit about like how Japan influences my practice or like whether it has changed or, yeah, I kind of, this is something that I find a bit like uncomfortable in some ways, or like very aware of that, like there is this like strange, well, it's not a strange tendency, it's like carefully orchestrated and has like racial relations and stuff, but like to like orientalize Japan as like the land of cool and weird stuff that, yeah, it's just a very uncomfortable perspective. And I come back to this very often within myself and whether my practice is part of this in any way, which is ultimately not for me to say. The way that I kind of make sense of this. So when I first came to Japan, I didn't have intentions of living in Japan for a long time. I just kind of, I knew that I was interested in bits of the subculture. I wanted to see more of it. I wanted to go on trips so I could go on more pilgrimages, go to more remote places. And then there just happened to be this really great scholarship that gives you money to live for 2 years. So that was outstanding as a fresh graduate. So it sort of happened as a result of these things. And then, well, I ended up coming back. And then as I was living in Japan and learning Japanese, I started being able to read academic texts or just interact with Japanese fandom itself in a different way, as like not as like an outsider, but as like someone who was inside it, but to an extent as like, well, still like with an outsider perspective. But yeah, and then there's very different perspectives, obviously, that come up in like fandom-based academia in Japan. So I kind of made it as a thing that maybe the best I can do is to learn the language, interact with the stuff that is happening, and then not take the position of like someone who is coming in to make grand observations, but like someone who just is there and is trying their best. And if that's not enough, I will have to make my peace with that because it's ultimately not for me to decide. That's a very long-winded answer.
When you mention fandom, would that be translated as otaku in Japanese?
To an extent, yes. But there's like the word fan exists in Japanese as like someone who is the fan of something. Otaku would be someone who is a fan of something to the extent that it's like it's embarrassing. Like embarrassing, well, like embarrassing in like a social sense. Well, obviously this has really strong political connotations as well as like what counts as embarrassing behavior, and it really reflects in the history of like otaku spaces within Japan and how those places have been appropriated by the local governments to like be used for like cool Japan soft power. but that's maybe a different thing.
Mm.
But yeah, so it's like the stuff that I read is the like otaku related academic texts, because it's the kind of fandom that I'm interested in, is like the otaku levels of fandom, like not being a fan of something as like, oh yeah, I watch anime on the weekend, but like something that you don't really want to disclose to your like close friends because you feel like a sense of embarrassment, or like there is like an intensity that makes people nervous, which is also a different way of interacting with the materials. And like, not, I think a lot of the fandom I like to think about is the kind of fandom that refuses to stop with what the official sources provide to you. Like, yeah.
Geekdom is, being a geek in Western culture now is a cool thing. And you see it proliferating on social media, on YouTube, and all these different areas where people are discussing culture, people are dissecting culture and specific aspects of culture, and bringing those in and seeing it as a cool thing. This has happened in the past 10 years, and is this something that has happened, as you were saying, in Japan as well, that it's become almost a more mainstream thing to be geeking out or nerding out on a subject matter? And how does that influence sort of visual culture?
Sort of. I think, well, a good example I can provide, for example, is that like there's this district in Tokyo called Akihabara, which is, it started out as like a, you know, like a town for selling electronics, and then, well, like the nerds started congregating around the computers, obviously, which you need to play games, and then it started quite organically becoming like a gathering place for these like otaku type nerd people. And then as like the whole Cool Japan movement started, which is like a movement from the government to kind of promote Japan as like a destination for foreign interest. They started coming into Akihabara and then starting to organize their own events. And the fans that congregated in Akihabara, even like maybe it was not reflected in the language necessarily that was used, but they were definitely doing queer practices. That like there was lots of people, for example, who for lack of a better word now, I will say men, who would cross-dress as their beloved young female characters. To what extent you could call these people men is, well, a question. But like there were like interesting gender relations, for example. But then after the Cool Japan movement started, and then the government started being more present in Akihabara, they started organizing conventions, which are cool because it promotes like Japanese subculture to like the general public, but they started forbidding people from crossplay, which is when you dress up as a character of the opposite gender. So it was like there's like a very obvious like when politics come in, or like governing bodies come into the nerd relationships in fandom, or like mainstream culture, which often comes with its really uncomfortable and icky connotations of like cishet normativity. A lot of the queer stuff gets just like shaved off and pushed to the side, even when, well, from my experience being in fandom since the ripe age of 11 or whenever that started, like queer people tends to be at the forefront of these alternative cultures, because you are forced to quit your own alternatives because, well, it's not represented in any way, or if it is, it's done in ways that are not satisfactory.
Queerness is something that proliferates throughout your practice, especially in terms of the creation of a character. A digital version of ourselves online should automatically be genderless. It would be portraying, putting a political perspective onto the character to say that it is a specific gender. There has to be a reasoning for it. How much of this queerness do you think has proliferated your practice, and Do you think that this layering within queerness has helped to develop the layering within the aesthetics as well as the overall nature of your practice?
I think most definitely yes. Something I would like to mention, which is it's something that is spoken about in relation to animation by like a number of scholars who write about animation and perception, such as like Thomas Lemore or Deborah Levitt, whose work I'm really deeply into. But something that they talk about is that a point of animation, even when it chooses to depict like cinematic realism, so like in like animation that looks a bit like cinema, like even when it chooses to do that, because everything has to be done by hand, like pixel by pixel, it's always like a meta narrative on like the words that it is constructing. So I kind of see the whole like character creation in a digital space, I guess, for these purposes. But it doesn't have to be digital. Like, for example, it could be like for like tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. Like if you create like a word that is not this one, and then you choose to have like a gendered system in it, that always has to come as like a meta-narrative about like why that gendered system feels relevant to you and why it has to be there. So well, this is something that felt very like obvious to me, but then I kind of started noticing that yourself kept being read as like a woman, which is a term that I really do not like to be referred as. I generally do not like to be gendered. But yeah, that was something that I kind of had to come to terms with, that just because a space has the potential to not have those structures inside, it doesn't mean that it will automatically succeed in creating space for that discourse. Like, for example, like there's a tendency to see like the metaverse or online spaces as like an open potential for anything, because, well, technically anything is possible within like a virtual, like a differently made reality. But then just because the potential is there, it doesn't mean that it will succeed in being a radical space. And then this is also something that like often comes up in like discussions of like queer fandom, which I tend to hold a very positive view on things just because I don't like to be sad. So I would like to feel joy about my future. But there's often a lot of talk about the potential of like queer fandom to sort of lead us towards like new queer horizons and different realities, or like not even queer fandom, but just like queer spaces to create new ways of being. But then just because they have this potential, it doesn't mean that they always necessarily enact this potential. And often there are cases of queer communities being like terribly toxic, or like some pockets of fandom just, you know, like when you just open Twitter and then you look at some things and then you just close the computer and then you're like, it's fine. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's that kind of strange duality of having to navigate potential, but also having to put active action in to reach radical conclusions.
The echo chambers that exist within social media can serve to hinder the actual notion of what queerness is. And yeah, I see how that would affect it. We have 10 minutes left, so I would like to talk about trains.
The trains have come.
Within your work, a lot of the time, if your character is going to be transporting themselves through a narrative, they use a vehicle to do so, and that vehicle in your chosen vehicle seems to be trains. First of all, why is this, and why do you feel that trains should be proliferating in work? What is it that interests you about trains?
Well, I think I may do some screen sharing for this, if that's acceptable.
Completely.
Oh, I am forbidden to share my screen.
Oh, no.
Uh-oh. Well, that is okay. I can sort of start. So the starting point in the beginning is that I'm really obsessed with this film from a director called Shinkai Makoto, who does like animated films. And the film is called 5 centimeters per second. And it heavily features trains. And I watched this, well, this came out in like 2007. So I think I watched it in that year. So I was 13. I was immediately obsessed. I was not able to tell people why I was so obsessed. This basically stayed the same throughout my life. It's still ongoing, and it's part of my practice. So I just had this, like, trains were automatically included in anime, and also they're quite prolific. So it sort of started from this. And there's also something about the melancholy of like a train journey, and then also like meaningful travel montages in films that I quite enjoyed, and then that led to like a personal interest. I am sharing the screen now.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to show some like bits from 5 centimeters per second that shows a train, because, well, that is relevant. And then I actually have a lot of footage from this actual train crossing that is featured in a lot of my work. So that's where the train interest started. And then trains just started naturally featuring in my work, just because they show up in anime a lot and I like to look at them. And I think they're like a nice device for meditation. By the way, there's also like entire magazines in Japan about specifically trains in anime. This is the, what's it called? The front page, like front cover of one of them that is called Animes and Trains. And it's exactly about what you would imagine. And it goes through various train scenes featured in certain anime, and then where those train lines are, and then relevant side information. So there's this like background pool of knowledge. And then I got into, I started reading a book called The Anime Machine by Thomas Lamar. And in the book, he talks about the shared history of trains and cinema. This is especially often used to talk about modern cinema, but he refers to this person who is called, I think he's German, I think his name is Skivelbush or Schrivelbush, I don't know how to pronounce it, but he talks about the experience of riding a train for the first time for people in that period was just absolutely disorienting, because landscape at that speed made no sense. It was like an out of human experience. And then the train window sort of becomes a frame that like re-renders the landscape from this like not quite human, not quite machine shared hybrid viewpoint. And then something that Lamar talks about a lot, which I will show some videos for. This also comes up in Openings, the video I made recently. This is some really insane train footage that I took on a recent trip. But he talks about looking out through the front of the train, and you kind of have this sense of 3D motion, as if you're like cutting directly into the landscape, like you're a bullet that is being shot through space. And Lamar describes this as like cinematic motion, where you kind of have a very clear sense of one-point perspective and like a set relationship between where the camera is, which is also you, and then the world that you're going through. But if you look out through the side window of the train, which I think this is from the same journey, possibly, you kind of have this sense of the landscape being rendered into distinct layers. Like you have the foreground with the cables here, and then the strange construction machines with the humps of sand, and then the river, and then the bushes, and then the hills, and then the sky. And it kind of creates this sense that it's not a crazy reality that you're looking at, but rather distinct two-dimensional layers that are moving in relation to each other horizontally at different speeds. And that creates a sense of like illusory movement. And basically that is animatic movement as opposed to cinematism, where you kind of, even though it creates a cohesive whole, you can always trace your fingers along the edges where like the different layers come together. And then in Lamar's theory, as he like goes on to describe in his book, he talks about how an animatic image, as in like an image made up of different layers that sort of preserves the internal perspective of the layers that make it up, can create something that he refers to as like radical perspectivalism, which is when instead of one overarching viewpoint, you're forced to constantly negotiate between different modes of vision. And also, to me, this ties straight into queerness, because I think it's that like really uncomfortable in-between space where you have to constantly negotiate existing models for motion, where you kind of fall into this like strange black hole gap that is, I think, the queer position, or like the ultimate potential of animation as I see it. I hope that made sense.
I think that was utterly fascinating and really gives a deep dive into your practice. The newest film work openings is available on your website. We're going to have to wrap up, so I can mention to anybody seeing this in Norway, the exhibition Ingen død, bare respawn, never death, only respawn, is on in Nitya Center for Contemporary Art in Lillestrøm until the 6th of November. If you would like to see some of Petra's work and experience playing one of her games, you can also see all of her work online. I recommend checking out their website. It's a fascinating way to spend a good couple of hours. Petra, I want to thank you very much for your time, and hope you enjoy your evening in Japan. I would say to everybody watching, thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. And we will end here.
Yep, thank you.